Hi, and welcome to Psych Health and Safety in Canada. I'm your host, Marianne Baton. The aim of the podcast is to share practical knowledge, tips, and strategies around psychological health and safety in workplaces. Each week, I'll have interesting guests from across Canada and indeed from around the world. And they all have something really interesting to share about what psych health and safety is and how we can do a better job of it in our own workplaces. Today, I'm really thrilled to welcome a good friend of mine and a colleague, Chuck Bruce. And we spent a lot of time together through the Mental Health Commission of Canada and through the work on the standard. And Chuck always has inspiring ideas and innovations to share with us. So welcome, Chuck. And tell me how a nice accountant like you ended up being so interested in psychological health and safety.
Thank you, Marianne. It's great to join you this morning and participate in this important discussion. Preparing for our chat today, I reflected on what's approaching 20 years of my experience in mental health and specifically mental health in the workplace, as it was then referred to. And what brought me into the fold, as you said, my background is purely in finance. And I, 20 years ago, was someone who considered themselves very ignorant toward mental health or mental illness in the sense of no background or knowledge. And when I transitioned from a pure finance role in the financial services industry to a more insurance-related role, it gave me a sense of looking at the elements of finance in the new organization and what the drivers were. And of course, as we knew 20 years ago, and we know more today, that mental illness, specifically in insurance claims of disability, was a driving force. It was 4 times any other illness category at the time. And I felt, as someone who needed to roll up their sleeves and understand the history behind not only what mental illness was, but what the driving forces were. And that gave me an opportunity really to reach out to then the local Canadian Mental Health Association division to engage in very early discussion to educate me on, I will say, mental health or mental illness 101.
Yeah, and yet, knowing you the way that I do, Chuck, you've got this ability to read people, which, if we go with the stereotype for an accountant, isn't as usual. But you really are looking at mental illness and mental health as part of the human condition more than you look at it as something that a certain percentage of the population have.
Yes, thank you. I think that was a compliment that I'm not a stereotypical accountant. And I say that with utmost respect to my fellow CPAs. I think from the first conversation I had sitting across from the executive director of the Canadian Mental Health Association in Nova Scotia, I was drawn into a conversation, I think, like no other I've ever had in my life, and not because I immediately found an attraction to mental illness or mental health, not because I recognized that it was something that friends or family were dealing with, because I've been very cautious in not trying to recognize that because of my lack of any clinical background. But I was drawn into these numbers and statistics around the then 1 in 4 and or the 1 in 5, depending upon the literature. And the more and more I started to understand from a general human population perspective, and this may sound funny coming from an accountant, but I pushed the numbers aside. And I really started to think that this is not a 1 in 4 or a 1 in 5. This is a population health issue, and we as Canadians or a broader audience that may be listening to our chat, I think have an obligation to not only understand the impact of mental health that we all experience, but also to respect mental illness in the context when people are struggling. And I think that brought me into the conversation deeper beyond the financial burden that was my primary reason for reaching out and having the early discussion. Marianne, to be completely honest, I thought that I would have 2 or 3 discussions with people that had a background in mental health and mental illness. And I would then have a foundational understanding of it, and I would move on then to, do what accountants do, which is analyzing the numbers more. And in what is now greater than 20 years of this experience, I continue on, I'll say, multiple times throughout every week, being engaged in something, be it reading or a conversation or some of the other work I do in my extracurricular activities that's related to mental health. And I will say my commitment and passion to advancing mental health across this country hasn't wavered since that first conversation.
No, and where I first ran into you was when you were tapped to be part of the Workforce Advisory Committee for the brand new Mental Health Commission of Canada. And can you tell us a bit about your experience there?
Right. So even I think it was within the same year, and I'm not sure the order of play, but our mutual friend and now retiree, Mike, who was then the inaugural executive director of the Workplace Strategies for Mental Health, or then I think the Center for Workplace Mental Health. The day, and Mike and I laughed about this, the day the center was announced publicly, that morning, I used the phone number that was attached to the bottom of the press release and called for some additional information. And who picked up the phone but Mike? And that was our initial introduction to one another. And I've enjoyed, every conversation that I've ever had with him. And I think shortly after that, the Workforce Advisory Committee was formed. And I received a call from Bill Wilkerson, who asked if I would be interested in joining. And I have to say, I was taken aback by the invitation and asked myself early on, what can an accountant bring to that discussion? Felt very vulnerable in regard to my lack of knowledge, sitting around a table of very intimidating people such as yourself, and people that had much broader and deeper discussions and experiences, both at a clinical and non-clinical level, even people with lived experience I hadn't interacted with on a direct basis throughout my lifetime. So I didn't know what value I could bring to that. And again, the first conversation that we had as a group in the boardroom at Great West Life, when it was your traditional round of introductions and so on, 5 minutes into that conversation, I was drawn and felt I'm at the right table. And I'm not sure where this is going to go. I'm not sure what my commitment is going to be or what value I can bring, but I felt comfortable with the group that I was surrounded with. And, that was 2007. And although we don't talk every day or every week, when we do talk, I feel any of that group, when I do reconnect with, I feel that we've had an experience that only lifelong friends can attest to.
Yeah, I say that all the time, Chuck, that it's been such an interesting journey because we run into so many people who have their heart in the right place, that the reason they're in this is because they care about humans writ large, that they care about the quality of life that people have, they care about those who struggle, and they really want to make a difference. And so whenever I hear somebody talk about, everybody's out for themselves or they're out to get you, I have to shake my head and say that's not my experience at all. Yeah, we get to meet some of the greatest. But the other thing that you brought up, that imposter syndrome, or as one of my professors said, the fear of the fraud squad coming and figuring you're not as smart as everybody else thinks you are, is
Absolutely.
is always there for all of us. And I think that we've had to work with senators, we've worked with other politicians, we've worked with clinicians and researchers, and many PhDs, and you start to understand that we're just human, and what your credentials are, whether it's CPA or it's something else, has little to do with who you really are. And that's one of the beauties of what we've experienced over the years. So we were with the Workforce Advisory Committee. What are some of the things that you're most proud of accomplishing with that group?
Well, I think the back in the early days of the Mental Health Commission of Canada, the advisory groups, I believe there were 7 established at the onset of the commission's days when it started in 2007. And I think that they really formed the foundation of what the Mental Health Commission is today. And they went through, like any new organization, there was a time and a place for that style of advisory group that were very hands-on, roll up your sleeves. I mean, we were volunteer staffers at the end of the day, right? And as the commission continued to evolve, then that model no longer worked because the organization had matured. But during that time of the Workforce Advisory Committee, I think I would have to single out absolutely the early work and challenge at that table around how we can have an impact in Canadian workplaces. What do we have to do? And it goes beyond knocking on doors and having conversations at a grassroots level. It has to be at the boardroom level. It has to be at the grassroots level, and the accordion has to meet somewhere in the middle. So I think the very, very early discussions and thought-provoking dialogue and challenge that ultimately resulted in a standard being created, that absolutely has to be number one. But in addition to that, I think if you look at different aspects of our population that is either in the workplace or aspires to be in the workplace, I think that was so attractive to me because, again, in my lack of knowledge or experiences, I didn't fully appreciate the aspiring workforce or the vulnerable community that was very committed, and since then have learned about many organizations that have won significant awards from an engagement or a profit or a cultural perspective around the hiring and attraction and retention of the aspiring workforce. And I think the work that was developed coming out of the Workforce Advisory Committee related to the aspiring workforce was particularly emotional for me in regard to we can continue to do more for that population group. So I think those are the two that stand out.
I remember Bonnie Kirsch would bring forward, well, what about the people that aren't in the workplace yet, that, are still struggling to get there, as you say, aspiring? And then she would say, I'm sorry, I'm bringing this up again. And I said to her, no, this is who you are. You're the champion. You need to keep reminding everybody, let's focus on this as well, because if we don't focus on the most vulnerable, then they just fall by the wayside and, are expected to figure it out themselves. So it's,
I think between Bonnie Kirsch and Miriam Edelson, I think their persistence and patience within the Workforce Advisory Committee really provided an education to the committee that there needed to be a focus on the aspiring workforce, in addition to only inclusive of workplaces today.
Right. And Marie Dansok, right?
And Marie, of course, as well. Yes.
Yeah. That they did that.
Can I ask that? Can I reverse that question to you?
Yeah.
What are you most proud of in that committee's lifespan?
Well, I think, if we look at the big thing, then it is how we eventually led to the development of the standard. But I think about some of the littler things too, like you brought forward the idea of 20 questions for leaders. And you had talked about a series that you had looked at. And so we created it, and it's still there on the website. We did 20 questions for unions, and it's still there. We did policy recommendations, looking at if you're looking at your policy through the lens of workplace mental health and psychological health and safety, how would you do that? So I think there were so many things that were done, but also that the committee themselves became individual champions with their constituency, wherever they were, whatever they were doing. And so it's almost like I think about Rosa Parks and the idea that she was just one woman on a bus, but when you look into her background, she was part of an advocacy group. She was being trained to think about the issues and to deal with the issues. And it's the same with all of us, is that we may look like individually that we just have it all together and we know what we're talking about. But the truth is we came together and we learned together, and that's why we're able to do what we do now. So
we were such a diverse group from many experiences, not only personal and professional experiences, but geographic in nature as well. I believe we were truly coast to coast to coast. And I think when I reflect on now, of course, asking me that question is generating a whole bunch of ideas, right? And it seems in many ways like it was last month we met, not 15 years ago, or I guess not 15 years ago, but 10 years ago. I think the other, walking into each meeting, you look at, of course, for significant amount of time of the Workforce Advisory Committee's lifespan, our friend Dr. Ian Arnold led us to great levels of success. And looking at an agenda, looking at meeting materials, looking at the objective of a meeting, I have to say I always walked through whatever door we were going into with my own personal objective of engaging in discussion of bringing people to an understanding from an accountant's perspective of, we have to be mindful of what the cost of not doing anything is. So we know what the cost of mental illness is in the workplace, purely from a numbers perspective. So I say a direct cost. We didn't then know the indirect cost related to the impact on humans, but I tried in my, I would say, analytical way of attempting to provide some insight to the rest of the group around, well, what if we don't do something? Because looking at a large part of the decisions to invest in workplace mental health typically falls to someone that has CPA at the end of their name. And until they understand that it is not an expense line, it is an investment line, many workplaces will not realize their full potential or exercise their full opportunity without understanding what a lack of investment is. And I think we only have to look at the example I use even in today's world, so many years later, is we only have to look at throughout Canada and or around the world, and the lack of investment in past in infrastructure, and where we are today in Canada, where the US is today, and other jurisdictions that have experienced a lack of infrastructure investment over the course of decades, and now realizing the burden of that investment that's required today. It's no different when you look at the investment or the other side of the equation around an expense of mental health in the workplace.
Okay, so you may be sensitive and you may understand workplace mental health and mental health in general, but you still think like an accountant.
Well, I have to still think like an accountant, because whenever I'm engaged in discussions, when I know there are accountants in the room, I know how they're thinking. So I have to find a way to hoodwink them into understanding that this is an investment and not only an expense line.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember when I didn't know you at all, we were at the table for the commission's workforce advisory, and I thought you were pretty quiet, but then whenever you opened your mouth to say something, it sort of landed and was profound, because it was very much from that objective, logical business sense. So it was only after, when I got to know you more, that I realized how cheeky you actually were, and that was just your persona for the board table. But let's move on now to your recollection of how we came to think that we might want a national standard in Canada on psychological health and safety in the workplace.
Oh, such a great question. I think that my recollection, having gone around the table multiple times and hearing from our peers that, again, such diverse backgrounds of people with lived experience, which is, we all know and recognize more and more that that voice is required at the table. We had academia, we had clinicians, we had representation from the military with our good friend Stefan. And I think that my recollection was the diversity of thought around how the first thinking around, I will say, a guideline versus a standard, and a standard versus a guideline. But more so than that, when you take a layer off the onion, I think it was purely related to the impact. So how can we get inside the doors of organizations in different industries across the country? And at that time, I don't think we were looking at anything beyond our country. And who would have known, right, that there would be interest beyond the shores and mountains of Canada? But I think we were initially focused, perhaps prematurely, on thinking that it would be more accepted or adopted more broadly within a small number of sectors, ideally within the public sector. And I think because of the diversity around the table, we very quickly turned our attention to, well, wait a second, why wouldn't oil and gas consider this? They have the same issues within their workplace as a provincial, federal, or territorial department of government. And then we looked at specific subsets of healthcare and first responders and so on and so forth. And I remember being one of a number of people around the table that as a dad to a now 17, soon to be 18-year-old, it was very important for me, and I know your kids were certainly a lot younger and more dependent on mom than Marianne than they perhaps are today. But I think very important for me was also that next generation of entering the workplace. And I went back to, I read a book some time ago in preparation of my former role in the insurance and disability sector. And it was a book entitled The North Karelia Project in New Zealand. And this was really around physical health at the time, but it was around changing behaviors. And it was North Karelia. North Karelia is a region in New Zealand. And some time ago, I think it was back in the 70s or 80s, they had a very high rate of death in sort of 40 and 50-year-olds. Very, very young men were dying. And in this region at that time, the book was written. The females in the household were predominantly minding the house and raising the children, whereas the males were working outside of the home. But they were dying when they were in their 40s and 50s. Of course, then leaving the family in turmoil. And the moral of the story was the initial thought was to change the behaviors and have the 30 and 40-year-olds eating more healthy. So less butter, less fat, more green vegetables, and so on. And someone came up with a brilliant idea and said, wait a second, until we introduce healthier lifestyles with our infants and toddlers and school-age children, we will never change the behaviors and the mortality of those that are older. So very early on in my workforce advisory committee days, I felt an obligation recalling the framework of that book that we have to do more for our youth, starting at a very, very early age. And I think that that further informed some of the work that we did when we developed the standard, in also considering those that are coming into the workplace at a later time.
Yeah, it's, when you think about drinking and driving, wearing seatbelts, recycling, wearing a helmet when you ride a bike, all those things were aimed at young children. And then those young children influence their parents to make those changes. And so it's no different that if we can help children to think about how to honor their feelings, how to honor their emotions, how to be able to process them in a healthy way, that it's going to have a positive impact on the mental health when they become adults. But it's also much easier to start young and have children really embody these things rather than wait until we have developed bad habits and then try to break us of them.
Do you recall our early discussions? I know that this will come back to me during our conversation, but do you recall our earlier discussions around the potential of a standard versus, I know we had considerable discussion and debate with respect to a guideline versus a standard. Do you, can you share your perspective on how we landed at a standard versus a guideline?
Yeah, well, I remember the conversation was that at one point, it would have cost organizations about 6 figures to get a consultant to develop a measurement of psychological health and safety and to administer that, to analyze the results, and then to make recommendations. And it was because we had a tool in Guarding Minds that was free that we felt that it was reasonable to request organizations to have a minimum threshold. That's what we were thinking at the beginning, a minimum threshold that supported the psychological health and safety of its employees. And we wanted it to be arm's length and consensus based. So that is where we started with the idea of a standard. Now, Ian Arnold and I actually went to the Canadian Standards Council at the time and asked them, well, what's involved? Because we immediately thought of the International Standards Organization, ISO. So we were already thinking bigger than Canada when we went to check that out. And in fact, when they gave us the requirements for an ISO standard, we reverse engineered everything we were doing in order that we knew we would qualify. And we held a roundtable in Vancouver where we brought together people from standards making organizations, people from the government, policymakers, decision makers. And the question we asked is, should we have a standard? Is that more red tape and a burden for employers? Or is that something that could actually support the evolution of workplace mental health in Canada? And there was good conversation about pros and cons. What we wanted to avoid was making it so difficult for employers to operate or to be profitable that we were inadvertently damaging their psychological health and safety. But we got enough information from the very wise people that were around the room about how to make a standard in a way that did not cause excessive red tape, excessive burden. And that's my recollection of our long and winding road to where we ended up.
Yeah, so again, our conversation is bringing back so many memories, as often conversations do. And I recall, due to family illness I was dealing with at the time, I was unable to participate in that first September event in Vancouver. But what I do recall is there was a very diverse group invited and accepted the invitation to participate in that discussion, and that was very rich discussion. It was a closed door event, whereas people could speak openly and freely and not have their comments attributed back to an industry or their organization. And those leaders from various industries had the opportunity to share what they felt were advantages, but also what they felt were limitations or restrictions in moving that forward. So I think that was extremely rich discussion. And I think as we continue to evolve mental health across the population, I think that model can and should be replicated more often when there are, I think we have the opportunity today, 15 years later, to have those conversations in a more open forum where people are not, leaders are not as concerned about voicing their opinion and having their organization attributed to their opinion, appreciating it is only their opinion. They're not necessarily speaking on behalf of the organization. But I think leaders today in the mental health conversation are much more open to have that dialogue in a public setting, to inquire with respect to what can and should be done across the land. So I think that was a very early start and very visionary in regard to when you look at how mental health and resources available to organizations have become available over the course of the last 15 years.
Yeah, you're making me think of another point that was really interesting, is that we started really thinking about, do we need a standard about how to treat a person who has a mental illness in the workplace? And that the conversation around that was, no, we have human rights. Like, we already have the duty to accommodate. So if we step back and think about protecting all employees, doing no harm to all employees, it actually will be protective for those who also have a mental illness. But then it becomes not about those people, but about us people, about everyone. And yeah, do you remember, Chuck, the conversation about language? Because again, we said, should it be the standard for workplace mental health? And do you remember why we decided against that?
No, that's not coming back to me quickly.
No,
but that may be age related as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we do have that going for us. But no, it was because people, when they think mental health, will automatically seem to go to mental illness. Whereas psychological health and safety, we thought they would automatically go to health and safety, which is the organization's responsibility to do no harm and to protect against harm. And adding psychological in front of it instead of mental would mean people would have to say, well, what do you mean? So they had to open their minds to something that was new. But yeah, all these little conversations that we had over the years, thinking about it and how it evolved in little bits. When you think, I mean, we worked so hard on that standard committee. When you think about the contributions that you made to that committee, what comes up in your mind?
Well, I think I'm not sure. Again, it looked to me, the technical committee established to develop the standard looked to me like the Workforce Advisory Committee multiplied by 3 or 4, because it had six or seven subsets of representation, which, not by design, but I think by perhaps a little bit of good conversation, good decisions, and a lot of luck, the Workforce Advisory Committee ended up being as diverse as it was. I think the technical committee was obviously, for obvious reasons, more structured in having various industries and representatives to ensure a full and open debate and design. I have to say, I think that I received more than I gave, and that's part of what I gave was only informed after I received, and it wasn't. I don't think that I was set up to provide value to that committee that informed the standard on day one. I think I was always a little bit, and accountants typically do this. I was always a day or two behind. So I felt that my value lagged everyone else's because I was collecting and receiving everyone else's knowledge before I formulated my own thoughts or opinions. And I think that, I hope that worked for the committee. It certainly worked for me in whatever contribution I brought. But like any group setting, I felt that the committee members were so engaged, so committed, but at the early onset, it was very apparent to me that the committee, and when we came together as a group, it was very apparent that we had to have fun, that this was not going to be show up at whatever time in the morning and go through the motions of developing this standard. And, it was very formal in its nature. We were a group of individuals that felt once the end of the day came and our work wasn't finished for that day, but we felt we had to come together as a group and enjoy each other's energy, personality, backgrounds at a very social or more intimate level in order to affect the next day's discussion. And I think because we as a group came together so closely throughout the journey of developing the standard was a significant part of the success of the standard at the end of the day.
Chuck, what you just described is what the ideal psychologically healthy and safe team or organization would look like, right? That we work hard, that we're passionate about what we're doing, but that we know each other in a way that we respect, support, and really root for each other to be successful, that it's not a competition, but we're all in this together. We have each other's backs. So it's interesting that the group that did the work to create the standard lived the principles of it.
Yeah, and in any other forum, Marianne, you will recall in any other forum, the different groups of representatives that we had were in general forums somewhat adversarial to one another. There is private sector, public sector. There is management union. And it was so healthy to understand each other's, I will say, position from a constituency perspective, that the conversations were never even started down a path of disrespect. They were always at the highest level of respect. And if it was the individuals from labor, if it was the individuals from private sector, from the insurance sector, from the public sector, both at a provincial and a federal level, I think that everyone felt comfortable and equally vulnerable to offer their own views and comments, be it personal or constituency based, which only helped inform at the end of the day. And I go back to, I remember, I may have the number wrong, but I think it was somewhere in the 800 or close to 900 comments we received back from public consultation. And we had a little bit of an informal side bet among a number of people in regard to how much feedback we would get. And some people felt it would be, plus or minus 100. Other people felt it'd be plus or minus 10. And I think there wasn't anyone in the room that anticipated the level of feedback that we received. And I think before we even went into that feedback, understanding the confidence that we had within different sectors across the country with that level of engagement was a very proud moment for the technical committee individually and as a collective.
Yeah, I think that was one of the moments when I realized, which I don't think most people do in the moment, is that we were making history, and that many people took the time to review and comment meant to me that what we were doing was important. And there's another time that I think about, and it goes back to what you were saying, Chuck, and it was Martin Shane. Yeah. And we had done a vote on something, and it, the majority said one way, and Martin said, well, just a minute. I am not comfortable with the fact that our 3 representatives with labor are all against this, and that we would just push it through, disregarding their issues. And so the conversation opened up again. we found a compromise and a way to have consensus, and we move forward. And I remember feeling so proud at the time that we didn't just, push forward. We didn't just say, too bad, so sad, we're not listening. We had a vote, that's it. We opened it up and we really got their view. And I was saying, because we're opening the standard up again now, and saying that this balance matrix that the Canadian Standards Association has so much value in not allowing any one interest group to dominate. And I know a lot of people will say, well, it was the Commission's standard, thinking that the Commission bought it, that
Right.
they told them what to do. And that's not true. It was a consensus process where the standard was done for the greater good of everyone. And the Commission has been the champion and the cheerleader from day one, but it's not their words. It really was that process.
Yeah, and I think you make an excellent point in that. I think as we continue our work around psych health and safety, I think the commitment of the diverse network that informed the development of the standard has to be built into the key messages, again, to show that it isn't a standard that was built by its funders. It isn't a standard that was built by who housed the standard, and it wasn't a standard that was particularly favorable to one sector versus another. It was a true balanced approach, and I think that we can and should continue to leverage that in the days and years ahead.
Mm-hmm. So, Chuck, we worked on the technical committee. The standard was released in 2013. What in your world has happened since then?
Well, in my world since then, of course, going back to that sort of, I break up different life events, if it's career, personal, and others, in that sort of 3, 4, 5 year time frames. And I think that helps me bucket memories and achievements and challenges and so on, and helps inform your next 3 to 4 to 5 years. And I think in 2015, so throughout the early days of the standard and the work that I think many technical committee members embraced around early adopters, and if you remember those challenges, and now we can look at those with a smile on our face and sort of a chuckle, but at that time it was certainly an uphill challenge to have organizations come in as early adopters. And Marianne, if I remember correctly, I think the greatest reason of that was that organizations felt that they would be exposed and exposed prematurely with respect to what they're not doing. And I know that, again, we spent considerable energy in those early days of helping organizations profile what they are doing. And if I remember using the analogy of a race, and if there's 10, pardon me, if there's 10 steps in the race, many organizations through their own insurance and benefit programs and internal policies are already at that sort of 3, 4, or 5. And when tested with a number of organizations, I think we built confidence with different organizations that they were at a 3, 4, or 5, and that this was more based on continual improvement, that every organization should practice every day, and we as individuals should practice every day, how to continuously improve our lives. And I think that those early days since the standard was formally adopted and the early days of adoption, I think I extremely enjoyed the energy that I had then to put into, I will say, marketing the standard in with the constituents that I had at the time that were specifically public sector and labor. And I take particular enjoyment in the confidence that was gained on the labor side back in those days to take action as employers and not as employee representatives. And that only informed then the opportunity for them to engage with their public sector employers to say, hey, we're doing this as an employer, you should too. And in Nova Scotia specifically, that had considerable success that I would like to think resonated to other jurisdictions to varying degrees across the country. Since 2000, sort of 15, 16, as you know, I've changed gears from a professional perspective and now lead a pension investment and administration organization as their CEO. When I started in 2016, it was a new organization with a blank sheet of paper, operating only on the basis of an agreement between unions and government as plan sponsors. And I had the opportunity and challenge to return to Newfoundland and Labrador to build this organization from the ground up, which to me is an exciting thing to do, terrifying for others, something that I run to and not from. And so I've had, I will say, in some respects, from a professional perspective on a daily basis, less time to devote to psych health and safety in the workplace as I had in the previous 5 years. But with that said, I've also continued to lend my time with the Mental Health Commission, and that keeps me regularly engaged on I'll say a very regular basis in mental health discussions in general across the country in its work, but also with a particular affection again to workplace and a particular affection to youth. So in the last 5 years, my shift in focus has changed, but I have now sort of 4 years into our new organization, we are as an organization placing a particular focus around mental health in the workplace or psych health and safety, and looking at now that we have transitioned as an organization and we have, I will say, the right foundation, we have the right building blocks, now's the time to introduce more commitment to that area of our business. And I have to say that it is equally informed by our short life that's less than 5 years. I'm reminded on a regular basis that about 40% of our time as an organization has been spent in a pandemic. So that brings a completely different perspective to the role, and that's a little a peek through my time and energy over the course of the last 5 or 6 years.
So Chuck, there's CEOs all across the country who are dealing with the pandemic, are dealing with supply chain issues, are dealing with talent recruitment and retention, are dealing with a changing economy. And we're saying to them, well, you should pay attention to psych health and safety. And you know how challenging that can be when there's everything else going on. What would be your advice to CEOs in particular who are saying, of course, I want to do the right thing, but there's so many things that I need to do?
Of course. So I think first and foremost, I have I'll say three professional passions. One I'll say related to mental health. One related to good governance, and another related to retirement security. And I think I go back to about a year ago, I was asked to sit on a panel of my peers in the pension, investment, and administration industry. And at the end of the panel, the one question the moderator asked was, "What's keeping you up at night?" And there were three individuals on the panel, and two of my panel colleagues highlighted things specific to markets, capital markets, the reaction to capital markets as a result of the pandemic, inflation, and so on. And I felt that I happened to have the opportunity to go last. And I felt that they had captured that very eloquently and very concise. And I took a completely different path. And my one statement was mental health of my employees and their families. And this generated more questions than the other two combined. And I had about a dozen people follow up with me after that session and said, that took me off guard. I wasn't expecting that to come from you. And can you tell me more about that? And it gave me an opportunity to open the conversation and talk about my experience and continued work in mental health across the country. And I think, so first and foremost, that's a long way of getting back to your question of what would I tell CEOs? And I think first and foremost, specifically coming out of this pandemic, I think organizations are at risk. And there's one word that a CEO does not want to hear, and that's at risk, or two words. And I think that organizations' engagement, recruitment, retraction, and retention is at risk in addition to the products and services that they deliver. If leadership is not engaged in the conversation around mental health of their employees and psych health and safety within their organizations. Full stop. Every conversation I have with my peers in the industry or outside of the industry at my level is a message that I give both as a CEO and both in my capacity as chair of the board of the Mental Health Commission of Canada. And so first and foremost, it's understanding your organization is at risk. Second, closely related to that is take a pulse of the organization. It's a very basic way to get a sense of where your employees are, the services that you provide that are working versus are not working. And for those that may be concerned about an expense line, there is such a vast array of complementary services at no cost available in the Canadian marketplace. Marianne, you are someone that has had a hand in, I'm not going to begin to count what resources, but the resources that are available, you have been a leader across this country in making those available to every size and industry of organization in the country. That's number two. And I think number three, take a look inside your own self and your own circle of friends, family, colleagues, and understand that this is not about a 1 in 4. This is not about a 1 in 5. That your children, your siblings, your parents, your colleagues, your extended family, there are people within that circle that were struggling pre-pandemic, continue to struggle during the pandemic. And I have a significant concern about the after effect of the pandemic, especially with youth and those that have been working remotely. It's I think, easy to look at organizations that are implementing these hybrid workplaces or full at home work from home. And I think in our early days of the advisory committee, and it's now coming back to me again, that we spoke and the development of the standard. What about those individual contractors that are working at home in their home office day in, day out? We didn't pay a significant amount of attention to that because we felt that it was a small subset of the working population. Well, boy, weren't we wrong when we factor in COVID, and now the amount of individuals that are working from their kitchen table or their home office that isn't set up properly from an ergonomics perspective and or a mental health perspective. We have men and women that are balancing parental responsibilities in addition to child or elder care responsibilities. And I think post-pandemic, keeping this hybrid workforce or full at-home workforce without the right protocols in place to support our employees is going to have a significant impact on engagement, culture, and ultimate achievement and productivity. So those would be, I'll say, my top three in looking forward.
That's great. That's great. And this is a good place to wrap up and to thank you, Chuck, for sharing all of your experience on this long and winding road, and to say that these things that you're just talking about, funny enough, we started working on before the pandemic. And so many of the resources and information about independent professionals working from home, hybrid teams, we do have available now. So that you're saying to CEOs, pay attention and don't just let this be another extension without thinking about how to do it in a psychologically safe way. So,
absolutely.
Yeah. So thanks again, Chuck. The whole video will be on Flourish DX's YouTube channel, but we'll take little short clips from your most brilliant statements and share those on LinkedIn and social media. And I also invite anybody who wants to connect over LinkedIn to ask more questions or follow up with this conversation about all the brilliance that Chuck shared to do that. So thank you, Chuck.
This has been an excellent way to spend an hour and a half. And in closing, in addition to a thank you, and I'm glad we had an excuse to reconnect. I think that your reference to a long and winding road, I hope the road continues to wind and that you can't see too far ahead, because it's great to be visionary and plan for the future, but I think we can only plan so far. And if I go back to that 2013-15 timeframe, who would have thought we would have had the experience that we've all had in the last 2 years? So it's great to plan, but also be somewhat fluid or flexible in how we all move forward, in that there will be turns in the road that we have to adapt to. So thank you, Marianne.
Yeah, thank you, Chuck. Over and out. The first podcast I did, instead of stopping the recording, I just cut the person right off, and it's like, oh, sorry. But so that wasn't too bad. You tell Tina that I was right and you were wrong, that you're just fine. You didn't need to have preparation. And there are so many things, though, Chuck, that you shared that I think are really valuable, especially to leaders, because I know that that's always the issue. I'm actually going across the country this year giving a free workshop on called Motivating the Powers That Be. And it's how to talk to the decision makers, not about why they need to pay attention to workplace mental health or psych health and safety or do the standard, but rather, what do you need to accomplish? And let me help you. And then you embed your psych health and safety in helping the leaders rather than trying to ram something down their throat. So that'll be interesting.
So how are you going to who's going to be the audience for that?
It'll be primarily consultants, HR, facilitators, health and safety folks. But it's those that are trying to convince, that we need to do something. People in wellness, that they're trying to convince and just saying there's a different way to do this. And I know a lot of people say, but you helped develop the standard. Don't you want everybody to implement it? And it's like, no, I want everybody to have a psychologically healthy and safe workplace. And
absolutely.
Yeah, however they do that.
Are you familiar with Superfriend?
Superfriend, sure.
Yeah. So specifically spun out of the pension industry, right?
Yep.
So again, in my, I'm always looking for an in or an angle in engaging others of either a different level or a different industry and whatnot. And I've had this on my agenda for the last, I'll say 4 or 5 years since I started Provident 10, in looking at the right time in introducing the potential of mental health resources to the retirees that all of my peers across the country support by way of payment. But one of the things that I find is, so we have, we bring money in from active employees, that is contributions to the pension plan. We invest the pension plan assets, and then at the end of the day, we pay out monies to the retirees. Once someone leaves the workplace and is receiving a pension benefit, the pension industry typically forgets about them. Mm-hmm. We pay them then on a monthly basis, and that's it. We consider that those individuals are happy as long as the money arrives in their account on the 15th of the month. And I'm looking at it and saying specifically to our population in Newfoundland, where we have about 35,000 people in the workplace, active employees. We have about 22,000 retirees. I'm looking at, we have no relationship with these 22,000 people. What can and should we be doing for those 22,000 people? So I just share that with you in your circles, and not to give you something else to crowd your mind, because I know it's pretty full already. But at some point, I'd be interested in having a more targeted discussion with you around what you think the opportunity might be. If I look at my understanding of what the Superfund model is and how it's funded, and really is what they're doing effective, and what, if any, of that model could be brought to the Canadian marketplace?
Yeah, so I know Margot, who is the head of Superfriend, yep. And they've already inspired me. So Plan for Resilience came from a discussion with somebody that was employed at Superfriend. And it is because Superfriend existed originally to reduce suicide. Okay. Because that was their main cause. They've branched out into workplace mental health. But they also did look at retirement. And so I created 2 things around retirement. One is the Retiree Interview, which is, how do you help someone have a graceful exit, where they sort of have an exploration of all the things they've learned and all the things they've contributed, but you're also getting that knowledge transfer to whoever's going to take over, because a lot of employers don't do that. Yep. But the main purpose of this is to let the retiree leave on a high note, and to allow the employer to now have a champion and ambassador who's going to speak well about them, not like, I couldn't wait to get out of there. The other thing that we created is called Retiring Well. And what I say is it's a lot more than money, right? And so the Retiring Well resource is about thinking about who's going to be in your life. What will they contribute to you and your quality of life? What will you contribute to their quality of life? What are the things that you want to do on your own? And what are the things that you want to do with other people? And so those two pieces are what I've done so far on retirement. But the piece that I think you're talking about is that there's two things that people who are retired could benefit from you. One of them is a sense of purpose. So how can they mentor? How could they give back? How could they maybe attend meetings, things like that? The other is how you can help them. And I know with OMERS, so that's the Ontario Municipal Employees Registry, Retirement, whatever, there's something that somebody has started up where they give you information. They're talking to you about what's available. They're talking to you about anything that might be of interest to retirees. And some people I think it's $25 a year. Some people like me, I just get the information from them, but other people are really involved. They're involved with the board of this Retirees Association. They're involved with writing articles. They're involved with reviewing movies or books and writing about that. They're in advocacy work. And so starting an association with your own retirees may be your ability to do a lot with them. And the odd thing is, Chuck, I know you would want to do it and you'd want to make it free for all retirees, but charging $25 a year makes them more committed.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that gives me a couple of things to think about.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you again. I really appreciate it. And it's just so great to see you. Just so great to connect again. I sure miss the times where we could work together.
Well, let's do a better job of that.
Yeah.
And have a
in your
regular
spare
check-in.
time.
Well, listen, I got about as much spare time as you do, but these things are important for our own mental health, right?
True. So. You've certainly improved mine today. So thank you.
Well, you have a great day and I look forward to the next time we chat.
Okay. Take care, Chuck.